Okay, part two. So we were just talking about the Anglo-Dutch Wars. Another thing to realize is that the wars of Louis XIV were very damaging to the Dutch in general, but of course the Dutch trade in the Atlantic was also weakened because of these wars. They're sort of preoccupied with the fact that Louis XIV has been invading the Netherlands for a number of years. So, just as a recap, remember that there were two Dutch wars in the Wars of Louis XIV, the First Dutch War and the Second Dutch War. Um, and Louis attained quite a few towns in the Netherlands during these wars. So that's the reason why the Netherlands are weakened by these wars of Louis XIV. But the Netherlands economy still survives intact because their Atlantic trade networks are breaking down. They decide to turn more towards banking. Um, so actually, this is backwards, just so you realize. I can actually fix it right here. So trade, which was their previous priority, is going to shift over to banking. I'm glad I caught that. Um, Now, the Netherlands also are the first country to perfect the use of paper currency. And they also have a stock market. It's centered in Amsterdam, and it's the most important stock market in Europe. And they also create a central bank. All right, so because the Netherlands have a very successful banking industry, they're able to still survive with a fairly intact economy even after their trade networks in the Atlantic break down. And again, just as a reminder, that is a result not only of the Anglo-Dutch Wars, so England is going to benefit at the expense of the Netherlands, but also because of the wars of Louis XIV. Okay, those are two of the major reasons why the Netherlands are starting to fall out of the picture for the Atlantic economy. All right, so another thing we need to realize is how France is going to be declining during this time period. So we need to be aware of some of the colonial wars that are taking place during this period. All right, just as a little bit of background, the two major enemies that we're thinking about are Britain and France. And this is a long-standing pattern. All right, we're thinking about Britain and France as enemies even when we get into the American Revolution. That's why the French get involved, right? So just going backwards a little bit, for the majority of the 18th century, Britain and France are involved in a series of wars, and many of them concern maritime trade and colonial expansion. So when I say most of the 18th century, I mean 1701 to 1783. Britain and France are at war in some way, shape, or form. All right? Now, France has the largest army on land, and it's working to build up its naval forces. And France and Spain are working together during this time period as well. And some of that has to do with the War of Spanish Succession, which we're going to talk about in just a second. Um, but it's also important to realize, like we were just saying, the Netherlands are in relative decline, but Spain is also in relative decline. Remember the decline of Spanish absolutism? Remember that for a long period of time, the Habsburg rulers of Spain are very weak. We got to Charles II, no heir, right? We also see the Netherlands, the northern part of the Netherlands, are lost to Spain in 1681. So Spain is declining for a number of reasons. All right. It's also just important to realize that these colonial wars are not just taking place in Europe. They are a series of world wars because they involve fighting not only in Europe, but at the high seas and in the New World. All right. So let's go through a few of them. The War of Spanish Succession we've already talked about, but just as a review, remember that there was this potential for the Bourbons to control both France and Spain. Remember that Charles II, King of Spain, dies with no heir. So he decides to leave Spain to Philip of Anjou, who was Louis XIV's grandson. Right? So this would mean that Bourbons, right, they're from the family of Bourbon, would be ruling both France and Spain. So this becomes a huge threat to other countries like Britain in particular, because they think it's going to upset the balance of power in Europe. They think that France is going to become this huge superpower. All right, they think that if there's a union of France and Spain, this is also going to mean that all the colonies that Great Britain possesses along the East Coast, they would be surrounded by their enemies. New France, which was in the north and the west of the British colonies. I'm going to show you a map just in a second, but you know what? I can show it to you now. It actually deals more with what happens after the Seven Years' War. But this, at this point, was all French, right? And then we have Spanish. So if the French and Spanish are joining together, then they have the British American colonies completely surrounded, which the British do not like. Okay, so basically, what we see is that because there is an alliance among the enemies of France and Spain, the war results in the Treaty of Utrecht, which weakens both France and Spain. All right, this basically represents the defeat of Louis's expansionist ambitions. All right, so this is a huge kind of huge devastation for the wars of Louis XIV. It also shows that France is going to be left in serious debt, and this is going to kind of catch up to them when we get to the French Revolution. But just to remember what France loses territorially, they lose Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and the Hudson Bay territories in the New World to Great Britain. Also Spain, remember Spain and France are allies during this war. They have to cede Great Britain, or sorry, they have to cede the Asiento, which is the slave trade, to Great Britain. All right, so Britain is the major victor after the Treaty of Utrecht. And it really is emerging. If we already talked about the Dutch wars, right, which benefits Britain. This is yet another reason why England is becoming so powerful during the 18th century. Okay. Next. Okay, the War of Austrian Succession isn't as significant, but it's important to realize that it took place. It's a series of battles it's an 8-year war. Okay, it's a series of battles between England and France, both in North America and India. All right, but the end of the war sort of results in preserving the status quo. So the colonial empires, the map does not change really at all after the War of Spanish Succession, unlike the Seven Years' War, which is much more significant, okay? This is the biggest world war of the 18th century. Now realize that what's going on in Europe is partly dealing with Maria Theresa's attempt to gain back Silesia from Prussia, all right? But Prussia ends up surviving this war with all of its boundaries intact. But what we want to focus more on for this unit is what's going on in North America with the Seven Years' War. All right, so this actually begins in some disputed territory between England and France. All right, in the Ohio Valley, and the French forces, and also they were allied with Native Americans, which is why it's called the French and Indian War. They fight British and American colonial forces because they want this disputed territory to go to France, obviously. All right, so this is why the French and Indian War become part of the Seven Years' War in Europe. But because of William Pitt, who was Britain's new prime minister, he decides to change Britain's war strategy in the middle of the war, and it is his intent to focus Britain's attention much more on North America. And France, meanwhile, was more preoccupied with the conflict in Europe. So this could be one of the major reasons why England ends up winning the French and Indian War. All right, so Navy-wise, Britain's Royal Navy defeats France's Navy in various engagements on the high seas. All right, France tries to invade Great Britain, but because it has so many naval losses, it ends up not attempting this. All right, so because of this, because there are so many naval defeats by France, France's trade is going to drop significantly. Before the war, its trade on the Atlantic was 16 times what it was after the war. All right, so France is going to lose its sugar trade with the West Indian colonies, and also they're going to lose some of their trade in the East as well. Britain is going to take control of the French posts that are near Calcutta and Madras in India. All right, so they're going to lose their trade network both in the East and West. So Spain tries to help France in the French and Indian War. But still, Britain ends up also hurting Spain as a result. They seize Cuba and the Philippines from Spain after Spain decides to ally with France. And so the war results in the Treaty of Paris, okay, which is really the most important European peace treaty since the Treaty of Westphalia. Remember that, 1648? This is very important. Also remember the Treaty of Utrecht in between those. That's very significant as well. All right, we already talked about that. So France is completely removed from the North American map after the Treaty of Paris. All right, France loses Canada to Great Britain, and it loses all of its colonial possessions east of the Mississippi River. And I'm going to show you a map in just a second. Also, because Spain was helping France in the war, France gives its Louisiana territory to Spain. So this is why France has no territories whatsoever in the Americas anymore. Also, just so you know, to the east, France has to accept that now England is dominating India, especially in Bengal. Even though France keeps some of its posts there, British trade in India is far more powerful. And this is going to have long-term consequences because England, its most important colonial possession in the 19th and early 20th centuries is India. All right. Also remember that that Spain cedes Florida to Britain so that it can get Cuba and the Philippines back. All right. So that trade happens. All right. And so again, because of the 7 years or French and Indian War, Britain becomes the most dominant colonial empire. Okay, so it's a number of military reasons. We already said that the wars of Louis XIV are one of the reasons why England becomes so strong because it gets the slave trade, it gets all these other French territories in the New World. All right, another military reason why Britain is becoming so powerful is because of the French and Indian War. And just to visualize it, this was the map of North America before the French and Indian War. So you can see France has all these territories. These are the disputed territories we're talking about. So the war starts in the Ohio River Valley, okay? And after the French and Indian War, here is the change, right? So we see Spain used to have Florida, and now the colonies have it. Now the British colonies have it. All right, they get all of the land that is east of the Mississippi River, which is huge. Okay, France, see how there's French territories represented in yellow? There's no French representation whatsoever. They had already lost the Hudson Bay territory after the War of Spanish Succession. Now they have no colonial influence at all in North America, right? Spain is going to have Louisiana territory, and we're going to see eventually how that pans out. So it's a significant loss for the French. I think this is a good time to stop this part, and then we'll have one more part, and then we'll move on to the French Revolution as our next unit. So, continued with part 3.